So good afternoon. My presentation today will be more focused on the French case because it's part of my ongoing postdoctoral research. And I will complete a bit the presentation that you just heard from Miria, which was more from the audience perspective, and she was linking a bit how it's interrelated with the production process. From my side, I will try to find a question if the media is whether responsible or not for the rise of Islamophobia and the antipathy against the so-called immigrant population from outside the EU. This is quite a kind of ongoing discussion topic in France over the last 10 years, and there is pretty much a lot of work done on it. So I will start first with a kind of overview, mixing it with why it's relevant to work on the mediatization. So, of course, we all agree that the importance of media is undeniable in the construction and the shift of collective attitudes, the exact nature of media's role vis-à-vis racism as well as ethnic relations. But the role of media stays also a bit of controversial, and still there is kind of different point of views regarding that aspect. Some argues that media are feeding stereotypes with giving voice, for instance, to extreme rights, and so that it turns so visible their topics. For others, media are merely a reflection of the attitudes and behaviors that exist in society independently from them. I believe that the analysis of the content, the impact, as well as the determinant of the relationship between media and representation of diversity is a contextual prerequisite to better define and implement social relations, social inclusion policies, their effectiveness and their relevance, as well as the inclusion of people that are seen as foreigners or as outsiders. I put some English titles because it's more an Anglophone presentation that I do, but similar ones are findable also on the French mainstream media. And when you make an overview of the state of the art on representation of diversity in the media, you can see that these help to better define the contours of the policies and programs. Why to work on mediatization is relevant? On one hand, representation, which is by representation we understand the number and the visibilities, as well as representation in terms of content and mode of treatments of people seen as foreigners in the media, influences public opinion in the way that media represent fragments of diversity in everyday life, with its stereotypes and as a consequences, the way otherness is accepted in a society. On the other hand, the perception that public opinion has of a group seen as a foreigner might also influence representation of diversity in media production. You see that for groups that are seen as foreigners, the perception as well as the representation of themselves in mainstream media productions are important, because recognizing yourself in society is one of the very key basic stages for social inclusion. And media, they do not only influence the acceptance of otherness in a society, they also influence the capacity and also the capability of people and to include diversity into a common set of value. Media, in that sense, have a dual responsibility in the sense that they affect public concerns by determining the agenda, what you have to think, but also they have a role because they contribute to shape the perception of reality by same public opinion, what to think about what you see. Therefore, when you work on media and diversity, one of the central questions is what kind of role can media play in imagining and mobilizing communities of belonging and transforming them. there is a series of questions that appear on 3 levels, according to me. The first one is on society scale, the other one is on community scale, and the last one is on the mediatic scale. On community scale, you can set 3 main ones. There is so many others, but the most important, I believe, are those 3. And out of these 3, I would focus especially on which role can media play in the cultural perception and representation of diversity in order to promote social cohesion, in order to promote social justice or social change. And then we can also go and focus more on the community scale. Here we can think, for instance, about the importance of what kind of organizing power media can have on different levels. Since we are in the Western European media scales, for instance, we can try to understand how they interact, the local level, the national level, as well as the transnational level. One of the important things is also to understand what kind of version of diversity are represented once it's come to see how these media are talking about diversity. How do they compete? Do we talk about ethnic diversity? Do we talk about cultural diversity? Or do we talk about religious diversity? Is it ideological diversity? Which kind of diversity appear the most? And at which levels one point is more important than the other? And what kind of demarcation can be made between the factual, for instance, and fictional understandings of diversity, or the speculative or real versions of diversity, or the counterfactual and counterfeit versions of diversities. Then we can also approach the media scale. On the media scale, we can, for instance, wonder the impact of the popularization of ICT on diversity-related matters. For instance, we can think what kind of diversity is promoted through the ICTs, and at which state that diversity promoted stays. Is it more an individualist level that we talk about? Does it stay more at the individualist level, that discussion about diversity, or is it more a small-scale kind of conviviality, or do we talk more about a large-scale sociability once we talk about diversity in the media and on the internet in this case? And again, it's relevant to see how these different scales are related to each other. One problem that appears also once we start to talk about this media scale and the popularization of ICT, and this different level, I mean the individual, the more small-scale conviviality, and the society-scale popularization of topics related to diversity, can also bring a kind of discussion about the public sphere that we discuss about. Because I argue that the popularization of ICT might split the public sphere into ideology, class, gender, ethnic, religion-based groups, and so on. And in that one, if we start in internet or thanks to popularization of any kind of technology, each of us to discuss in our own corner, I wonder what kind of mutual understanding across this division might be still possible. Because if a public sphere is divided by such lines, it's quite hard to breach such differences. And if so, then how we can breach it, and what are the norms, what are the symbols and ideas that can help to transcend this divide and act in favor of transcultural public spheres. Of course, I'm not the first one that talk of such things. And once you start to work on a state of the art of what has been done on these 3 levels of questions that I just explained, you can see that scientific works mainly focused until now on complex relationship between media production and social representation. Such studies, of course, were quite helpful in understanding phenomena such as social and political exclusion, discrimination, racism, and participation. That participation also included a questioning about how people seen as others, as foreigners, can be included in the media. And they showed also that how media can produce social representation of immigrants by using categorization and labeling. Those labelings were not just based on words that we were used, it was also based on image that we were distributing. On those scientific works, as a main methodology, you see that it's basically, and it's often discourse analysis that are done, and those discourse analysis as a methodology is used to try, in order to decipher essentializing attributes once it's come to talk about diversity, about immigration, about foreigners, about ethnicized groups in general in Western contemporary societies. You see, for instance, in France, a lot of works done based on some particular words, on some vocabularies, or on some images, by a bit analyzing the history of some terms and seeing that way some kinds of semantic shifts in media discourses. And when you see, if we can speak of the line of a term appearing, disappearing, reappearing, and so on, when you see it starting in the press first, later on audiovisual production, some terms were coming back ultimately, you can see that some are going back to the colonial past. So you see that media coverage is considered here on all these works as a kind of social indicator of the society, and by following the story of the terms, you try to understand what are the intercultural relations of a certain time and how some terms, some images that you see on the media are contributing to the construction of some collective identities. The works essentially dealt with the production process of diversity and the multiple ways in which actors constructed, deconstructed, or played on the images in the media. Through the images through the images of diversity, I refer here to the othering process, which are namely the categorization as other of women and men of different ages and social backgrounds that are designated according to their supposed or real origin, their background, which can be close or distant in time, in space. They can be close or distant in their appearance, in their color, in their lifestyle, in their culture, their name, and even surname. And that such works has been best illustrated, I believe, with the emergence of the term banlieue in France. You see that researchers, but not only researchers, also practitioners that worked on banlieue, worked a lot on how the term banlieue has become a synonym for deprived, disadvantaged urban areas containing a high range of ethnic mixity, unemployment, and high crime rates in the media. Documentary filmmakers and visual anthropologists made quite a contribution to that work, and they fueled and boosted the production of documentaries dealing with diversity matters. I would like to share you the precious work done by Noriel and Dean Martin, who started to describe by starting early 20th and 19th centuries how in the news the term immigration appeared first. That work pointed pretty much that the representation and the talks that were appearing in the press were pretty much fragmented. They were appearing sometimes very intensively, while some other times they were just disappearing. Still, you can see that they managed to detect that all the time that the word immigration was appearing, it was in relation with problems in the society that they were coming. They also highlighted different kinds of foreigners that maybe we didn't think as foreigners when we talk about. For instance, in beginning 19th centuries, around the 1910, 1920, they found out that the outsider in the news, in the news, and particularly in the news at the local level of Paris, was referring to people living outside of Paris, so to the working class. Later on, there was a contribution that came from a historian this time, who tried to list all kinds of proactive forms of screenwriting that has been done, starting the 70s and starting the popularization of television in the French society. With his work, Afif Mills, he tried to decode images and to find out how this kind of common memory was built around images and discourses that were witnessing recent history. He showed, for instance, that by visualizing migrations and news, he visualized, based on a work done on the pâté cinémas, beginning of 20th centuries, there was news bulletin that you managed to see on cinema. And when you refer to when you type the word immigrant on the National Audiovisual Database, you were seeing all the time Italians appearing. It's starting more after the 60s that you have the appearance of Maghrebis as immigrants on the news bulletins, this time of different channels, because we talk from the 70s. But again, while making that overview, I believe it's not very fair to just blame media for such representation, because journalists are have often to work in a certain urgency to meet their deadlines. We can think of news coming from communication studies as a kind of fast food that we have to consume. They are quick to make and easy to consume, and therefore often when we read about some stuff, these news are selected parts of the event that a media wants to cover, that fits the most also with the editorial line of the media that people works in. And it's also in that point that Bourdieu criticized journalists when they cover, for instance, the banlieue. He said, I found interesting to analyze the ways journalists connect banlieue to urban riots and problems, and he continues by telling, selecting what's news is a search for sensation, for the spectacular. TV is an industry above everything, and journalists try to make an event they decided to cover with sensational images and words. Therefore, they exaggerate the importance of the event, they accentuate its gravity and its dramatic aspect. It's true that by writing, we manipulate what's real, and we pick just the part of our reality needed for the story. But journalists are not anybody, they are media producers, and they are therefore active actors that contribute to build mediatic facts. By mediatic facts, we understand here a partial reality that is constructed around binarities. Binarities like a white is opposed to a black, an anti is opposed to a pro, or a traditional is opposed to a moderated, or an old-fashioned to a trendy, a leftist to a rightist, and so on. So next to this, there is some journalists that also zoom in on particular extreme details, which creates also almost a kind of paroxysm that neglect most of the covered events' complexities. On that, allow me also to show how these kinds of problematics affects the everyday life of journalists. And I would like to share with you a fragment of a professional that works in Le Monde, the progressive French daily, when he talks and shares his experience about the hardness of the everyday life of a journalist. He talks that It was in April. I was waiting Brice Hortefeux, the Minister of Immigrant and National Identity, to talk about illegal migrant workers movement. I was in the waiting room with my colleague Laetitia preparing questions. Then Brice Hortefeux arrived, shook our hand and jogged. "Hope you have your paper," he said. That same journalist, when we discussed, he continued with the experience he had while he was covering Tour de France, the international cycling event. He said that he had to write an article about cycling fans, and when he approached the family, one of the young guys didn't want to talk with him. Some minutes after, his colleague had no problem to approach them. Afterwards, on the way back, his colleagues, his name is Benoit, told that when we've been taking our press card, the person delivering the card had the same kind of attitude. While she gave his press card, she asked if I was Benoit's chauffeur. So there is a kind of society, some established mental boundaries that are also hard, and that's therefore I don't find always fair to just blame media and journalists for it. It shows, such an example shows to us also how the everyday life of a colored journalist is pretty much similar to the ordinary citizen. One, for instance, explained also that he prefers to name himself as Mr. plus his surname in order to not give the idea that he is not, between brackets, a non-white French. So he said, "Since I started to work at Lyon Capital, I prefer to use my surname. It tells less about my background, and therefore it is not hard to imagine that I am a rebeu," which means a person with a Maghrebi origin. Okay. There is a last journalist that also said how in the banlieue revolts of November 2005, in mainstream media was pretty much searching for mainstream journalists were searching for freelance journalists in order to report kind of conflict areas. So you would imagine that in order to, they enter banlieue as they enter a kind of war area. It's pretty much close to ethnic conflict reporting, actually, his experience. And also there is some kinds of stories that remind pretty much of covering the news. By covering news, some journalists are reduced to their role to cover diversity-related matters that has some similarities with the way women in the beginning of the centuries entered the profession in order to talk about, in order to be a journalist, to become a journalist. They entered the pages by writing for and only about women. Women pages were created for them to enter the profession. And I'm afraid today regarding diversity matters, there is a growing expectation in this direction for colored journalists. And such behaviors and attitudes reflect, in fact, some kind of established hierarchical relations we have in the society. These are relations that are based on inferiority and exploitation of groups seen as others or as foreigners. I would end up with these questions. Why can't a non-white journalist write about opera, for instance? I believe this is a kind of question relevant when we work on media and diversity in the newsrooms, because such expectations that we have also restrict the role of a non-white journalist to a single identity, its color. And today's journalism world has begun to attribute a kind of function to colored journalists. Altogether, I believe we need to resist and challenge such division of labor, and therefore to question about media and diversity, thinking why should a woman journalist born in France named Fatma cannot work about sport, for instance. Another main question that came here is cyber balkanization. Cyber balkanization, I believe, is also one of the relevant terms once it comes to talk about media and diversity, since particularly the event we witnessed all together in Norway. I found it interesting because that starting point of that renewed discussions pick us to a point where we think about the effects of that extremist right-wing media can have on the everyday life and the perception of diversities. It is interesting to analyze, for instance, the perception of the feeling of belonging, as well as the collective identity representation of the self, as well as the extreme right practices on internet. You see, for instance, here, by seeing which kind of media used Breivik, that they were basically counter-jihad nationalist medias from either European landscape, US, counter-jihad website, mainstream media, whatever the language is, as long as the kind of idea is the same. In internet, you see that there is a variety of websites that fits on our own worldview. And most of the websites we visit in the extreme, for instance, in his case, are extreme right nationalist and Islamophobic websites. And in fact, this is not hard to come. For instance, beginning of the week, I asked to people with different age and different social background and different names and political views and so, to share with me the 4 results that they get when they type Oslo and Islam together on Google. You see, pretty much, these are the first the first 4 results. That starting the 3rd result on Google, you start to have totally opposite result. So the person A won't be aware of the kind of stuff circulating on internet related, for instance, to Islam, no, Islamophobia in Oslo, terror, it's not Islam, and so. So each of one will be in their own corner without knowing about what's going on the opposite side. I believe, therefore, that on internet, with the popularization of ICT, it's pretty much relevant to work on the concept that developed caste-sustained cyber Balkanization. It describes some fragments of an area into small enclave. It's based on the term Balkanization. And that phenomenon shows, in fact, how groups are increasingly turning increasingly to segregated communities that avoid exposure to other contradictory views. This is a kind of cyber Balkanization. Here is a kind of disintegration process on internet in which you isolate yourself from opinions that you don't like. I just finish. So you feel easily less as an outsider in what is considered your own territory. For instance, for Breivik, he turns a whiter, a more Christian on internet. While others, for instance, hail diversities, Breivik join, follows, reacts to those who has that follows his own point of view, and step by step, he starts to adopt the terminology and metaphors used in extreme right virtual world. Obviously, the main topic is Islam here. There is Islam, and I believe, therefore, that when we work on diversity, there is pretty much stuff going on the extreme right blogosphere as well that we ignore or we don't see simply because we do not agree with such things. And I finalize with say that media can play a role in finding an answer to living together with our differences, but the question is also how media can succeed to find these answers and into what extent media policies for more color in the media can help also to formulate an answer to such kind of ongoing Balkanization on the ICT world. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.